Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 176, and it's our final webinar for the calendar year 2020. And what a year it's been. A year of many problems and issues, but a year in which our webinar program has been a great source of activity and excitement for us, and I think many people. And I want to thank those of you who have come in today, and I see some regular names, very much for your regular participation. I think that having an ongoing constituency in the webinars has been really good, and I noticed that there's people who come in regularly have started to contribute more in the discussion over time. That's been really welcome. Today we're in Japan, and we're going to look at the public good role of higher education, but with a focus on Japan and in relation to data collected in Japan by our colleagues Futao, Huang and Kiyomi Horiuchi. I'll introduce them in a moment, but let me take you through the webinar protocols. And those of you who are regulars will know these off by heart, I'm sure. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course. Usually that's within 48 hours or so. Transcript of the chat function will also be posted. The webinar is the YouTube video when it's on the CG website, and it's in the YouTube format there. We notice that the take-up of our webinars is increasing. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. You don't have to have your video on during the webinar, but please turn on when you're asking a question if you can. It always adds something to the collective discussion to be able to see people's faces. We recommend using speaker view setting in Zoom so you can see clearly who is talking when that happens. We ask questions by using the chat function. When you've got a question, write it down and put it into the chat. You can send it to me, or you can just send it to everyone. Usually that's what people do. They send it to everyone. At the end of the presentation part of the webinar, we'll then compose the Q&A on the basis of what people are writing into the chat. We more or less follow the order that questions come in. Sometimes we mix it up a bit, but let me give you my regular advice. Come in early, put your question down as soon as you can, because questions that come in the last 5 minutes, often very interesting, tend to miss out because by then the Q&A list is composed. So when you're invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. Okay, let me move to the main part of the webinar now. Kiyomi Horiuchi is an adjunct professor at Hiroshima Cosmopolitan University, Japan. And prior to the current position, he worked in administrative positions in several Japanese private universities, and then as an associate professor at the Center for International Higher Education at the University of Kyushu in Fukuoka in Japan. He's interested in internationalization and the impact of English medium instruction at non-English speaking countries' higher education. Futao Huang, one of the best known names in the field of higher education studies, and great pleasure to have him, a CG researcher, on our program today. He's professor at the Research Institute of Higher Education at Hiroshima University in Japan, the famous HEI, famous for its internationalization policy, its long-standing policy of inviting visiting scholars from around the world to work in the university for a period of time. And I'm one of the many who've done that, and it's a great place to work. And Futao is a wonderful colleague amongst other wonderful colleagues at HEI. Futao, prior to coming to Japan, where he's worked for 21 years, taught and conducted research at several Chinese universities. His research's interests include internationalization of higher education, the academic profession, and higher education in East Asia. He publishes widely, not only in the academic literature, but also in places like University World News. So welcome, Futao, and welcome, Kiyomi, and we look forward to your presentation, and I hand the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning from Hiroshima, Japan. I'd like to share my slides with all of you. Simon, can
I
you
can
see
see
my-
it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And as Simon just introduced, Kiyomi and I would make an joint presentation. I will talk the first part of the slides, and Kiyomi will talk about the second part. So it's a great pleasure to talk with you about our recent research, and this is about the public good of higher education in Japan, and from the historic perspective. And this study explores three actors' transformational perceptions of on the public good of higher education in post-war Japan. This is our main purpose. Based on Borden Clark's model of that is the triangle of coordinations. We selected three main actors, and it is the central government, economic organizations, and association of universities. And based on our interview, based on discourse analysis, would like argue changes which occurred in their understanding of the public good in Japan. In terms of research method, this research is based on discourse analysis of the above mentioned three actors of official documents. And as an analytical framework, we present on both the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. In terms of the horizontal axis, we use the timeline from the end of World War II to the present, because according to most researchers in Japan, and fundamental changes in higher education have occurred at almost 15-year intervals since the end of Second World War to the present. This slide shows the main changes which have occurred in higher education in Japan from 1945 to the year of 2020. We, for each period of the 5 periods, and there are relevant distinct features of changes in higher education. Here you can, we just show you one of the indicators for each period. Here is the rate of university entrance. You can find each, there's a huge difference of rate of university entrance in each period of the post-war Japan. In terms of the vertical axis, functions of higher education relating to the public good are placed on the vertical analysis. You can find that the concept of the vertical analysis, axis analysis is shown in this table. As mentioned earlier, we used the three actors: government, economic organizations, and university and associations, as the objects of discourse analysis. And in terms of the functions of higher education, as generally agreed, it includes three. First, it refers to knowledge creation and dissemination. Second, it's about human resource development. And third is concerned with social and community contributions. And these three are normally understood that mediate the actors of perceptions of public good in Japan. Here is a table suggesting changes which have occurred in a number of universities in Japan since 1955 to 2017. And we just suggest two major drivers affecting quantitative expansion of Japan's higher education. And for example, by the end of 1980s, the rapid expansion of Japan's universities was mainly caused by a rapid economic growth. However, since the early 1990s, it was more driven by the regulation of government's policies on higher education. Also, one of the most striking features of Japan's higher education is the private sector accounts for a predominant proportion of both institutions and students. Here you can find, in terms of both institutions and students, the private sector constitutes more than 70% of the total. This is the first characteristic of Japan's higher education. Second, which is not shown in this figure, it is this clear-cut division of labor between national, local public, and private universities in Japan. National universities are funded, administered by central government. Private universities are established by school corporations, which are more driven by the market force. In terms of the missions and functions of national universities and private universities, the former is expected to facilitate the advancement of basic and applied scientific research, while the latter, I mean the private sector, is more concerned with the provision of undergraduate educational activities, and a majority of their degree programs belong to the fields of humanities and social sciences. I think this broad background may provide some basic information about features of Japan's higher education. So Kiyomi will talk about the second part of our joint presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, my name is Kiyomi Horiuchi, and thank you so much for having us in this seminar. Let me share the slide. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, Kiyomi, we can see that.
Okay, thank you. Well, before going on to the findings of the research topic, I'd like to mention a little bit about the terminology issue about the public good. The public good or public goods are usually translated into kokyōzai in Japanese language. But this term has a little problem because this kokyōzai conveys only the economic nuances of the public goods. And also the term kokyōzai is not that familiar term in a Japanese society. So the one example is I used the keyword search and the CINI. CINI, C-I-N-I-I, is the largest Japanese research database of the Japanese academics or international academics belonging to the Japanese research institutions. Then, well, I entered the quote unquote higher education and public goods in the, as the keywords. Then only 6 articles returned on the database. Among 6, only 1 article is about the Japanese higher education. And other 5 are about either European issues or American issues. Well, same thing actually, and that only 1 Japanese higher education article was written by the American academics. And also the same thing happened in the Japanese language too. I entered the Koto Kyoiku instead of higher education and Kokyōzai instead of public goods. Then again, only 4 articles are returned, and again, only 1 article is about the Japanese higher education and public good. So the discussion on public goods of higher education in Japan is not matured yet, and the terminology is not really familiar among the Japanese people. Okay. So as the Professor Huang has explained earlier, we decoded the term public good into the three public functions of higher education. Those are knowledge creation and human resource development and social contribution. And this is the outline of the findings. Well, about the knowledge creation function, no major conflict among actors was found throughout 5 periods. Well, actually, this is the only function that no major conflict was found. And second function, human resource development, the government and economic organizations stressed skills for future job since the second period. And basically, private universities associations agreed with the government and economic organizations' request, but the national universities associations resisted, or at least showed passive attitude toward this function until fourth period. And third function, the social contribution, the emergence of this perception of social contribution was later than other two functions, actually. So this could be said one of the characteristics of Japanese higher education system. And again, the National Universities Association was kind of resisted or showed the passive attitude toward the social contribution function until the fourth period. Okay, let's have more details about each functions. Okay. The first one, knowledge creation. Well, this is the only function, public function of higher education that no major conflict was found. And I showed some discourse from the government and National Universities Association. The government one is, the university's supreme mission has been the contribution to succession, criticism, and creation of culture through advanced academic research and education. This was the government discourse in 1971. And the below is the National Universities Association's discourse in the same year. The intrinsic nature of university is pursuing truth by research and education based on it. So basically, all actors, government, economic organizations, and private universities association and National Universities Association agreed with the fact that the knowledge creation or research function is the most important function of higher education. Okay, the second one is the human resource development. Okay, here, since the second period, government and economic organization have emphasized the necessity for vocational education and student skills for future occupation. This second period is coincided with the Japan's rapid economic growth. So during this period, the economic policy is prioritized as the number one most important thing for the Japanese government. So all the other things, including the education policy, have been affected by this economic policy. And this kind of really close relationship between the government and economic organizations has actually continued to up to today. Private Universities Association basically responded cooperatively towards social needs of human resources proposed by government and economic organizations. Well, actually, the expansion of private universities also happened during this second period. Under the rapid economic growth, there are more and more demands for higher education, and then the government allowed many institutions to open the new private universities. So from the beginning, the really important mission for the private universities is to answer the social needs. So they don't have anything against the government policy about the human resource development. But the National Universities Association's attitude was quite different from the private universities. There are two discourses from the National Universities Associations here. The one is from the second period, the social responsibility university education ought to take is not the fostering of white-collar workers, but the transmission of knowledge. And the bottom one is in the third period. Education and research at universities should not be easily affected by social trend of the times. It is reasonable that higher education keeps a moderate distance from society. So for the National Universities Association, human resource development is kind of byproduct as a result of the research activities, engagement of the research and education activities. Then moving on to the third function, social contribution. The emergence of perception is later than other two functions. During first and second period, the government and economic organization criticized the closed nature of university and requested the provision of lifelong learning. So they are aware of the social contribution function of the higher education, but it's only limited to the giving the more opportunities for learning to the working adults. But the perceptions relating to universities law and regional issues started to be found in the government discourse in the third period. Then it grown to the expectation that universities should be a center for the next generation's regional vitalization in fourth and fifth period. Okay, again, National Universities Association was rather resisted against this kind of request. Well, the above discourse is from the government in third period. Universities should cooperate with local communities and be open to the public in a number of ways, such as promoting regional planning, activating local industries. So they are requesting, government is requesting universities to engage in the local communities' activities or more contribution to the local area where the university locates. But the bottom discourse is from the National Universities Association in the 1971. Social contribution of university is not accepting all requests from society, but pursuing truth and contributing to healthy social development by returning research profits to society. So actually, it's the same logic with the human resource development. The one and only most important thing is the research activities or knowledge creation activities. And the social contribution should be a kind of byproduct of the research activities. So national universities are pretty consistent in their attitude of this. Okay, moving on to the discussion and conclusion. The investigation of historical transition of actors' discourse suggests that factors yielding the discussion of the public good of higher education in Japan include national universities' passive attitude towards social community contribution until recently. The second one is the contrasting views between the national and private universities. Usually, public good issue is related with the public funding, funding by the state government or the national government. So in that sense, in Japan, national university is supposed to be the one that should make a great contribution to the society. But the attitude of the national university is quite opposite. So that's why Japanese people cannot, conceive the true meaning of the public good of higher education, I suppose. And the other one, the contrasting views is even among the universities, national universities and private universities showed quite opposite attitude toward the three functions of higher education. So maybe general public are really confused what the university should do as a public function. So those kind of factors are affected that is leading the discussion of public good of higher education in Japan. Okay. And all actors' views on public function of higher education have rapidly converged into the same and fifth period. Well, I explained that up to the fourth period, only the National Universities Association showed a really, resistant attitude toward human resource development and also the social contribution functions, but they actually changed their attitude drastically in the fifth period. Fifth period means the most recent 15 years. The contextual changes influenced a lot, actually. It's more like a systemic changes. The one is incorporation of national universities in 2004. Until this time, national universities was the part of the government agencies. But from this time on, the national universities became an independent institution. So that means they are forced to gain more competitive funds and external revenue as autonomous institution. And second systemic change is the amendments of two major laws. It's a fundamental law of education in 2006 and school education law in 2007. At this time, finally, social contribution was added as one of the purposes of universities. Until this time, only the research, education, and human resource development was described as the purpose of the universities. But finally, the social contribution became the legal duty for the universities. So, well, actually, there are some possibilities that these systemic changes are hiding the true intentions of the National Universities Associations. I mean, National Universities Associations have to take more and more competitive funds from the government as an independent institutions. So they are trying to hide what they really think that might be happening. I'm not sure if it's the healthy relationship between the government and national universities, but that's the possibility. But at least during this recent 15 years, all actors agreed that all three public functions are attributes for higher education. So we expect the further discussion of higher education about the public good of higher education will be activated from this time on in Japan too. Okay, that's about it for the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
And thanks, Kiyomi, and thanks, Futao. You've given us some things to work with. So let's move into the discussion. Can I begin that process by asking you a question? We saw a change, not just the change after the year 2000, but there's the change back to 1990, the fourth period. The National University Association, the Association of Research Universities, took on a broader range of commitments. It committed to the human capital agenda and it committed to the social contribution agenda. What happened in the 1990s? Why did that shift occur? That was also the time of economic stagnation, I think, in Japan.
In 1990, what happened in the 1990s for the national universities? I see.
Because you've indicated the change in attitude to the public good functions in the fourth period.
I see. Yeah. Well, in the fourth period from 1990 to 2004, the attitude of the National Universities Association about the function of human resource development and its social contribution was a little bit softened comparing to up to the third period. But still, they showed their understanding that there are many social demands that national universities should be more engaged in human resource development or social contribution. But it's the period that they didn't really, take a concrete action up to the fifth period.
I've got one more question. How important is in Japanese universities is the question of values that students acquire? Do universities have a commitment to shaping students in particular according to particular social issues or social agenda? Is there a commitment, say, to sustainability or equality? I mean, are these parts of is this part of the mission of universities, or is it just left to individual, courses, individual teachers as to what values that students will acquire? I ask this because in some countries, there's a policy understanding of the kind of social values that the university should form in graduates. In other countries, it's just simply left to teachers to determine what values that students should acquire.
Well, in
Can
my
I answer the
understanding,
question? Okay. Now,
yeah. Well, actually, it was kind of left to the individuals or individual teachers too. But actually, about the evaluation system of higher education or universities in Japan is really, affected by the career success of the graduate students. So that's why the government and also economic organizations are requesting to the human resource development that is that can lead the economic development of Japanese society. And they really emphasize the job skills that is useful in their future career. And yeah, that's what Japanese universities try to engage more and more these days.
I'm sure that the crisis coming of the recession and graduate underemployment will probably increase the focus on job-related skills, at least in the short term. Now we've got a number of questions in the chat. Doria Abdullah, who asked the first question, has asked me to read it out on her behalf, and she and our second questioner are both interested in the respective role of public and private institutions in Japan. It's always because of the large private sector. You will, I think, have a bit of discussion now about the role of the private sector. Doria's question is, recalling the pie charts earlier in the presentation, can we determine when higher education became more private in Japan? When did that happen? And yet the number of public institutions seemed to not increase very much, but the number of private institutions seemed to increase. So what was happening there? Why did that happen?
Can I answer this question?
Mm-hmm.
Briefly? Thank you very much for the question. And I just mentioned that one of the most striking features of Japan's higher education is the private sector accounts for more than 70% of both institutions and students. One of the most reason is, and before the Second World War, there were already some, private university colleges in Japan, and which is quite different from any other, the East Asia systems. And this is one of the reasons. And the second is, soon after end of the Second World War, because Japanese government took a laissez-faire policy that let all these school cooperators to fund any types of universities or higher education institutions as they wish. And also, since the end of the 1950s, there was a very quick economic growth in Japan. So there was a rapid growth in the number of private universities and junior colleges. I think this is the big round. The Japanese government took a laissez-faire policy, and as a matter to encourage all these school corporate to run any type of schools or higher education institutions as they wish. And what is more important is, in 1972, the Japanese government passed the law and began to provide financial support for all higher education institutions, including private university and junior colleges. This is one of the most important factor affecting the rapid growth in numbers of private universities, because you can imagine almost 30% of annual revenue came from the public funding for those private universities and colleges. So I hope that I answered the question.
No, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Can I add one word about the private universities? I think the fast expansion of private universities happened during the second period, that is the 1960s to 1970s. That is coincided with the Japan's rapid economic growth. So there are more and more demands for the higher education among the general public, but the Japanese government kind of declined to make new national universities because it costs a lot. So one aspect is for saving the Japanese government cost for higher education. They just let the institutions to make the new many more and more private universities so that it will absorb the social demands for the higher education.
It's always intriguing about Japan that the way the private sector has become the main vehicle for massification and growth, but at the same time, the regulatory hold of government is fairly across all institutions is quite strong. It's not a wholly deregulated system in the sense that some other large private sector systems have become. You take India, for example, where the national government, the union government's got no effective control of the college sector at all. And even in the States, it's not regulated very closely. It's a very large sector, but in Japan, it's different. Now we've got Rosemary. I'm going to take them in this order. Rosemary Deem, Victorita Triff, David Locke, and Bala Subramanian. So Rosemary, would you like to come in?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about what the gender composition is of students in private and national universities. And the reason I want to ask that is because I think that affects two different aspects of public good. One is the question about skills training, because the Japanese labour market is still highly gender segregated. A lot of women don't work for most of their adult lives in paid employment. So that would be relevant. But also, I think that the conception of kind of community involvement is probably stronger in women than in men. Now that's a debatable issue. So that would affect it. My other question was, and I suspect this is not so true of the national universities, but maybe true of the private universities, is where do students tend to go? Do they go to universities that are near their home, or do they go to, obviously the elite universities presumably recruit across the whole country? Because that also affects the extent to which higher education institutions might want to be involved in community activities. Because if you have lots of people who come from that community, you have a much closer tie to it and a much greater interest. If most of your students come from across the country, then you may see your role as a national and international university rather than as one that develops local ties.
Okay, thank you. Simon, can I answer is two questions? I think two big questions, and thank you very much. And the first question is about ratio of, the women students in private university. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, that the majority of private universities provide degree programs, especially in humanities and social sciences. And you can imagine that there should be a greater share of the women students in studying private universities. This is, the common sense. But in the context of Japan's higher education, there's one more important background is since the early 1960s, there was a rapid growth in the number of private universities, among which a huge majority of them are private sectors. And almost all of these, newly emerged universities provide, the academic programs specifically designated for women students. They call it University for the Future Brightest. Rosemary, are you there? Simon, should I continue to answer?
Yeah,
please do.
you can't see me because my mic is not stable. Sorry,
okay.
that's why I turned it off.
And in Japan, the huge numbers of the women in university and junior colleges, they are called, university and junior colleges for the future brightest. So you can change, and even the largest numbers of academic programs are those disciplines relating to home economics. So I think that I have answered your first question. And for your second question, in Japan, the Japanese higher education is quite different from many other European continent countries. That is, it displays a very highly and hierarchical structure, and very few national universities and much fewer private universities enjoying academic and social reputations. And you can imagine only in Tokyo, and there are 23 million people, and a lot of them are young people. So if you want to get good job, you should go to these, the nationally recognized universities. But if you do not want get a bad job or bad salaries, maybe you can choose, to go to nearby, local universities. And also, there's one more factor is in Japan, there's a type of sector of universities which are run and funded by local authorities. We call it local public universities. The main mission of these local public universities is to train, the qualified, the manpower for the local economic growth. So you can find very clear, the division level between all the different sectors of universities, national, local, public, and private. So I hope I've answered your second question too.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks, Futao. Victorita, you have the next question.
Thank you very much. This is Victorita Trif from the University of Bucharest. First of all, congratulations for this well-structured session. Secondly, from the vantage point of eclectic literature in the fieldwork, it is a huge pressure of financial, socio-political, and ideological context. How will be shared the meaning of public good in Japan as a result of contemporary crisis? Thank you.
Simon, can I respond to the question?
Sorry for disturbing. Can I ask you again?
Oh, okay, go ahead, please.
What do you mean by the contemporary crisis?
I think in the COVID-19.
Yeah, and the recession, and the recession coming out of it.
Recession and about the economic crisis.
I see.
Economic crisis and COVID crisis.
Professor Huang, do you have anything about the COVID
okay,
crisis?
I try to answer the question. It's a very important question. And as a matter of fact, for the last 5 years, we've been conducting the interviews with some key actors in Japan. And one of two projects is about how the concept of public good of higher education is perceived in Japan. And according to some of the findings from the interviews, and no one denies that higher education in Japan is a public good, but no one admits Japan's higher education is a pure public good. So I think this is a baseline and from which we can start our discussion. And in Japan, and since the emergence of the COVID-19, and both the central government and the local authorities have provided financial support for not only local students, but also inbound international students. One of the rationale for this is this is generally agreed by both, how to say it, is the policymakers, university academics, and the public, that higher education is a public good. They need to be supported financially and at least in this crisis. I think this is quite different from many other countries. And even inbound international students is being, they're given and handed out, and they are treated the same as local students. And even local authorities have provided financial support. For example, my university, Hiroshima University, is located in a very small town, and the city hall and even provide financial support for both Japanese students and inbound international students studying in Hiroshima University. So I think Japan, the central government, local authorities, and individual universities have taken very positive and active and measures to fight against the impact from the COVID-19. I don't know what will happen to higher education or university students because of the spread of the pandemic. No one knows, but I believe that since higher education in Japan is conceived to be a public good, I think all these stakeholders will continue to support the higher education, including those inbound international students. Thank you.
Thanks, Victorita, and thank you, Futao and Kiyomi, for your answers. Now, David Locke, you've got the screen next.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. Simon may have partially answered my question in some remarks that he made, but to what extent are universities in Japan autonomous, and to what extent do they define what their own public contribution is going to be?
And Simon, can I answer this question?
Well,
it's a very important,
to what extent?
Very big question.
Yeah.
And compare, for example, and from comparative comparative perspective, for example, compared to China, there's no any national level compulsory academic programs in Japanese universities. And institutional autonomy means each university has its own powers to determine the mission and, for example, set up, admissions for recruiting students, staff, and design academic programs. That is, try not to be affected by the central government. I think this is the basic concept of institutional autonomy, which is widely understood and accepted by all the Japanese universities, including those national universities. I can give you an example. The Science Council of Japan is the top academic and scientific organization consisting of all these top scientists and researchers. And since the early 1950s, the Science Council of Japan has repeatedly announced that no member university is allowed to undertake any military research, which is quite different from, the central government policy. So you can imagine how autonomous Japan's higher education is, including those national universities, let alone these private universities, although they are more affected by the market force. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Futao. Thanks for the question, David. Our next question is from Bala Subramanyam, and who I think is ready to ask his question. He's already on video. You'll need to unmute.
Okay, I think I am unmuted now. Can you please? Yeah. Okay. Many thanks for the excellent presentation. I'm just wondering what has been the impact of internationalization in other parts of the world. Internationalization has made some big changes, either in terms of the way the students are recruited, the way staff are recruited, and also the importance given to internationalization in the university rankings by Times Higher or QS. So this has been a driving factor in the way the universities have defined themselves as international, and does that particular self-definition, or rather an external definition, impact on Japanese universities? I would also put a second question, which I probably relate to, in some ways related to this, which is how the national and the local public universities are differentiated. Is it purely in terms of funding, or in terms of a constitutional provision like in India, where they have different roles, the central and the state governments, or is it land grant basis like states, or like a cantonal basis in Switzerland? So what is the difference between the two, and how this has affected the roles that you have discussed in the paper? Thank you.
Kiyomi, could you?
Sure. I'd like to answer first, then could you add some information later? Well,
okay.
Actually, yeah, thank you for the question. And about the internationalization issue, in the government discourse, the internationalization was first emerged in the third period, that is in the 1980s. That time, the internationalization became one big issue for the higher education policy in Japan for the first time. And during that time, until the second period, before the third period, Japan was just seeking for the economic growth or economic development. And actually, Japan became one of the economic powers until the end of the second period. But after that, actually many advanced countries are criticizing Japan because Japan is gaining a lot of benefits out of the economic activities, but they are not contributing to the international community at all. So that's why government started to care about the internationalization of higher education as well. So at that time, the internationalization issue is more, linked with the international contribution, like accepting the international students from the developing countries almost for free, and then nurturing the human resource, good human resources, and return them to their own countries. But their kind of policy about the internationalization has changed in the fourth and following fifth period. This recent period, the government started to focus more on the international competitiveness of the higher education, because as you mentioned, the international university rankings became a big issue for all over the world. Then Japan has really cared about it, because the ranking of the Japanese higher education or Japanese university is getting lower and lower in the 1990s. So they started to fund more and more to the Japanese universities for, became research universities, only for the selected universities though. So that's kind of one of the stream of the internationalization policy about higher education in Japan. And another question about the difference between the national universities and local public universities. Well, it's like a relationship between the national university and state universities. I'm not sure that exists in the European countries, but the national universities, the national government is basically funding the universities, right? And the local public universities, the prefectural government, local government are funding the universities. So that's the difference. And the number of local public universities are a little bit more than national universities, but the student ratio of the local public universities is much smaller than national universities, because the local public universities is established based on the human resource needs of each area. So if the one prefecture needs more nurse or more middle school teachers, then they establish the prefecture universities, and they only have the Department of Education and Department of Nursing. So in that, like these cases, usually the local public universities are pretty small, smaller than national universities, and usually basically funded by the local government, not national government.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question and that answer, Kiyomi and Futao. Thank you, Bala, for your question. Very nicely put. And you can see more about the institutional structure, the sectors and so on in Japan in our book, High Participation Systems in Higher Education, published in 2018, edited by Brendan Campbell, Anna Smolensova and myself. The chapter on Japan gives you the history too of the sector, and well worth reading, I think. I'm going to ask one more question, I think, before we close. Now, while we've got you, this is a little bit off the public good topic, not entirely. The funding position in the national universities. I visited Japan last, Futao, you remember, I think in 2017, I came to Hiroshima, and I also went to one other leading national university during that visit, one of the top 4, and spoke to the president there, and he said that he was having great difficulty replacing professors who left in the key disciplines, the sciences, that funding was so short that despite the, the extra money available for top universities and so on, funding was so short that he could not maintain his research capacity fully. And in particular, opportunities for young people, were very scarce. There are very few posts for postdocs and for PhD graduates and so on in the sciences. Has that situation improved? And what will happen after the recession, because of the recession and the pandemic?
Kiyomi, I will try to answer the Simon question, and first, if anything you want to add. Yes, you mean that Hiroshima University and Tohoku, I think that is one of the most important reasons why there's a shortage of and constraint of funding national university is that maybe since that April 2004, all national universities become national university corporations. That is, the central government has cut, the public funding for all the national university corporations, 1% every year. So you can imagine for the last 16 years, at least 60% of the public funding has been cut by the central government for individual national university corporations. This is the most important reason why, the president complained about shortage of, funding. And the second is, national university has not been so used to the impacts from the market force. they have not established perfect governance arrangements to deal with, I mean, the impact from the market to compete with those private universities to recruit new students. This is another reason. Because if you cannot, I mean, recruit sufficient number of new students, you cannot, I mean, get enough, I mean, the tuition fees to maintain the operation of a university. And the third, as mentioned earlier, national universities are expected to facilitate the advancement, basic and applied research, while private universities are not expected to undertake any big science research activity. They spend less money. They only concentrate on the provision of undergraduate educational activities. And national universities spend much more money, far more money, because doing research, especially basic and fundamental or pure research, needs a lot of money. So I think all these are main reasons for, I mean, the shortage of funding. And I don't think much improvement could be made in the future.
Yeah.
No. And national universities are now trying hard to get those external, they call it external funding, by undertaking cooperation with industry and private companies, because they are not allowed to level the standard of charging fees, tuition fees from students. There's a national, I mean, the regulation on them. What they can do is to try to get more money by undertaking cooperation partnership with industry and private companies.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, and I guess until there is a change in the fiscal policy, Japan's, great national universities, great imperial universities as they once were, will remain sleeping giants at the world level because, there's enormous scientific capacity there. Great, these are great institutions with great track records in terms of Nobel Prizes and, massive achievements in physical sciences, especially, and yet, held to some extent back by the funding position for decades now. And you can't help feeling that if it changes, it'll change a lot. And, you'll see a big shift, and Japan will come back in a sense as a great powerhouse of science and higher education, which of course it, in many respects it still is, but it will fulfill its potential again. Let's hope it happens because it's a really important country for us. And, that's something distinctive and something really important about higher education in Japan, which adds to the total conversation and understanding of what to be an educated person really is, and what an educated society is. In some respects, Japan does things better than anyone else. And, we've all got a lot to learn from Japan. I want to thank you both for coming into this webinar late at night for you as it is in Japan, and come back again, Futao and Kiyomi, your contribution really appreciated. It wasn't our biggest webinar audience, but people stayed to the end, which shows that you held a very good level of discussion. Let me, at this final webinar for our series, thank Trevor Trehan for his great work in managing this webinar series and managing all of the communications with webinar presenters, making sure that the website notifications are posted well and that the webinars are posted properly afterwards, after they occur, and that they're advertised effectively through social media. I mean, Trevor really carries the series in many respects. I want to also thank the Economic and Social Research Council of the UK and also the Office for Students and Research England, who contributed to the ESRC support for the Centre for Global Higher Education. I mean, the Centre for Global Higher Education is only able to mount this and maintain this webinar series as a kind of global service to the field because of the support of the ESRC funding that underpins the centre. Let me also say that on this day, just before a final decision is made about the relationship between the UK and the EU, we are hanging on the precipice of a no-deal exit. We think now that a no-deal exit is very likely to occur, with likely catastrophic immediate results in terms of the relationship, the practical, economic and social and cultural an educational relationship between the UK and the continent of Europe. And we in the higher education sector greatly regret the need to say goodbye to our colleagues in the EU. We look to the opportunity to continue to work together, and we'll be doing our best to minimise the damage in this break of relations, to re-establish the research and student exchange partnerships, which have been so important to so many people around the world. It's a black day for us, to be honest, in the UK, but we are still, if you like, global, and we hope that that will include Europe as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking part today. And we look forward to seeing you for Doria Abdallah on the 7th of January next year. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.